Breaking news, ladies. Registration is now open for the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, Class of 2023, and we start the first week of January. If you are a women's health professional with an existing practice and you've struggled to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your client work, this is the program you've been waiting for. There's nothing like it offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. We start the first week of January 2023. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAMLive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 437. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health, because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today, I'm sharing a special episode on the topic of utilizing your menstrual cycle as a vital sign in your professional practice. When I first started teaching fertility awareness back in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago, my main goal was to teach women to understand their cycles. And a big part of that was because of the incredible transformational, life-changing experience that I had had. Maybe it feels like a bit of an exaggeration, but charting my cycles has really changed the course of my life in many ways. And it just made this huge difference in my personal journey and experience. Part of the reason it made such a big difference for me was because I did have challenges with my cycle. I struggled with painful periods. I struggled with a thyroid issue that I didn't know I had until it was picked up on my chart by my charting instructor. I think that I'm on that spectrum of insulin resistance, and with a different diet, I think I could give myself pretty significant PCOS symptoms just due to my history of long cycles. They weren't necessarily irregular, but they were certainly long. And in retrospect, I think it had something to do with both my thyroid issue and potentially some insulin resistance, which I know is in my family. And there's a number of other issues and challenges that have come up throughout the years. And all through those times, trials, years, doctors, health professionals, my charting has been the constant. And for myself, it has given me just a ton of confidence in understanding my own body. I really know what's normal for me and what's not. And I'm at the stage now with charting, given that I've been charting for over 20 years, that I can really gauge what's going on in my body and in my cycles by paying attention. It's something that is second nature to me now. It's something that I take for granted. And in my day-to-day behind the scenes work, what you don't see when you listen to the podcast is that's really what I do all day long. I spend my days supporting my clients to do the same, to understand how to use the menstrual cycle for practical purposes, for avoiding pregnancy as a birth control method with that 99.4% efficacy. And also supporting my clients who are trying to conceive to identify any potential underlying issues that could be playing a role, understanding correct timing, understanding how to confirm ovulation, and then looking for other factors that could be playing a part for clients who have been trying to conceive unsuccessfully. And then there's the other aspect of it, which is overall health, using the cycle as a way to monitor that and really getting deep into that understanding that the menstrual cycle is a reflection of your overall health. And if you are a woman of reproductive age, having a menstrual cycle that falls into normal parameters is a sign of health, similar to having blood pressure within normal parameters, or, having a normal heart rate when you're sitting down. All of these things are real-time measures of what's happening hormonally. And that brings us to the topic that we're diving into today. For the past 2 years, I have been offering the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program for women's health professionals who really want to delve into the menstrual cycle and utilize it as a vital sign in their practice. Practitioners in this program learn to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in their practice and learn the relationship between the menstrual cycle and overall health. By understanding the various parameters of the menstrual cycle and understanding how those parameters vary with a variety of different health challenges, the menstrual cycle becomes this incredible window into your client's overall health. And beyond that, it's a personalized tool. It's something that's unique for every woman and is able to really kind of match with whatever's happening in their lives in real time. So an incredible tool to add to your practice. So in today's episode, I'm going to be delving into the benefits and application of utilizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in your professional practice. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So for many of you listening to the podcast, you are already familiar with the idea of using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. But I wanted to start by just going through why we should consider the menstrual cycle a vital sign. And at the most basic level, a vital sign is a way to measure how the body is functioning. The most common vital signs that we are used to and that our doctors use to monitor how our body is functioning include our heart rate, our temperature, our respiratory rate, how many breaths we take a minute, and our blood pressure. Now, when you think about these main vital signs, what's interesting about them is that not only do they provide your healthcare practitioner with a specific window into what's happening in those, direct measures, they also tell your practitioner what to look for. So when your blood pressure is elevated, not only do we know something is wrong in general, but we also know the practitioner would know what is a short list of things that can cause high blood pressure. So it gives your practitioner a starting point beyond just the general information that there's something wrong. And what's interesting is that the menstrual cycle can operate in much the same way when you are trained in how to identify those subtle changes and how they can relate to overall health. And so, one of the great examples of that I often share with clients and on interviews are some of the common health issues that we know. So a great example of that is hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA. And so HA is what happens when a woman of reproductive age who should be having regular menstrual cycles stops menstruating. So she stops ovulating and she stops menstruating. So neither are happening. And when this occurs for a period of 6 months or more, or I would suggest when it starts happening at all, but officially we're usually looking at that kind of 6 months or more to show that it's a condition that's kind of ongoing. It not only tells us that something's wrong. So the first step is understanding that, yes, if you are a woman of reproductive age and you're not having your cycle suppressed by hormonal contraception or something like that, you should be having regular cycles. So unless you're pregnant, breastfeeding, you should be having regular cycles. And if it's not taking place at all, it gives us the general information that something's wrong, but it also gives us specific information. So with HA, we know based on the clinical presentation that some of the most common factors that cause a woman to lose her period when it's related to HA would be overexercise, undernutrition, and stress. So when a woman of reproductive age loses her cycle, shows she stops ovulating and stops menstruating, it does tell us where to look for information. And there's a number of different ways this could play out. So another example would be how this could play out for a woman, a young woman, a teenage girl who hasn't yet started menstruating. And so we know that the average age of menstruation, the first menstrual period, menarche, is about age 13. And so when you have a teenage girl who is 16 or 17 and hasn't had her first period, again, that in and of itself can show us not only that there could be something wrong there, because that's well beyond what we would consider to be the average age of the first menstruation, but it would also give us the information to just look and ask some questions about how she's eating, how she's moving, and what else is going on in her life. And when I talk these things through in a most basic fashion on the podcast, it seems quite obvious, in retrospect. When you hear these things, it makes sense, obviously. This is not the only reason why women might stop menstruating. And, stress can certainly play a role. There's other conditions that can cause this type of issue. But as a basic starting point, this is one of the most common reasons that we would see that. And what's interesting is that many women are missed with this issue. We're often taught that, oh, well, if she exercises a lot, it's normal to lose her period, or it's normal for the periods to be a little irregular. That's just what happens when women exercise a lot. And however, we're not necessarily looking at it as a problem. So that's kind of an introduction to that whole idea of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, and a couple really concrete examples of how this can play out. Now, there are other examples that aren't necessarily as drastic as a woman completely losing her period. It could be as simple as having irregular cervical discharge or a regular vaginal discharge, I'll say. And so with charting the cycle and understanding what's normal and what's not, what are the normal parameters for cervical fluid, what it should look like, when it should occur, those types of things. Then when you're charting and you start to either see, cervical mucus every single day or something that looks like mucus. So again, I'll use the words vaginal discharge. That can be as basic as helping a woman to identify if she has a yeast infection or another type of infection or STI, or, even in some cases, cervical dysplasia. There are abnormal patterns of discharge that are associated with abnormal cervical cells. And the absence of cervical fluid could also provide information. So these are just some examples of how we can actually utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And when you're not just kind of grasping at straws, but when you are trained to look for specific patterns and specific challenges and understand all the different things that can show up in the menstrual cycle and how that can work and how it can help you to support clients, and of course help you your own self to be able to support your hormone health and all those things, it's an incredible tool. And it's so interesting because it's a tool that we all have. It's happening whether we know it or not. So your body is always sending you information and signs. Whether you are tracking your cycle or not, it is happening, whether you're aware of it or not. And so given that it's happening already, it's often a wonderful gift and blessing to be able to delve into that intentionally and start to utilize it. And so the way that I often talk about it with my clients is that you're having, in a way, a conversation with your body. Obviously, you're not talking, but you're paying attention to the signs that your body is sending you. And then you might make certain changes to improve your hormonal health or your menstrual cycle health or what have you. And then your body responds in one way or another to give you feedback as to how well your interventions are working. And it really is just one of the most fascinating things. I'm a little bit biased because this is what I do for a living, but it is really, really fascinating and rewarding to be able to see these changes, especially if you're kind of science-minded and a bit nerdy like I am. It's a very interesting process because you're able to use that kind of scientific mind and try different things and see how your body responds. But it's also very rewarding because you get to see for yourself that the interventions you make can make a really big difference in your cycle at times. And that's really, really empowering, especially in a culture that often tells you that there's nothing you can do. You just have to go on the pill or you just have to take this drug or whatever. So it's really empowering and very useful and very practical in that perspective. So that was the first point I wanted to cover. Why should we consider the menstrual cycle as a vital sign? So the second point I wanted to talk about is just the idea of having the menstrual cycle as being an important piece of that puzzle. So from the professional standpoint, if you are a women's healthcare professional and you work with women on a day-to-day basis, but you don't fully utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, I suppose the question would be, are you missing an important piece of the puzzle by not focusing on the cycle? So a lot of the feedback that I've received from my practitioners is that often they're not, if you're not even asking questions about the menstrual cycle, I mean, maybe you're just asking, are your periods regular or whatever, but that in of itself can be helpful, obviously, to identify some of the biggest issues that can happen with the cycle, but you're not necessarily getting a lot of that nuance by not either knowing what to delve into or going into the level of depth that you could. And I think what consistently has happened throughout my work in this area with both women who are charting their cycles and practitioners who are charting their own cycles, as well as working with clients, is that it's really, I think, unexpected how much can show up in the chart, or just how sensitive your cycle can be to a variety of issues. So some of the things that I commonly experience with clients and practitioners is just that kind of the real-time changes that happen. So if you're going through a stressful situation, a stressful month, you're moving or something's happening in your personal life, and you notice some of those changes, whether it's a change in the luteal phase or a delayed ovulation or some spotting that doesn't usually happen or whatever the case is, I feel like it's interesting because we're not necessarily used to looking at our cycles this way. I mean, unless you've been charting for a while, it's something that's new. And I find even for women who come into my programs with charting experience, it's still really eye-opening to see how many things can just show up. And what's really common, I think something like this happened even yesterday in one of my client calls, is that you're experiencing the cycle that's odd. Something's different, delayed ovulation, whatever the case is. And you're kind of looking at it as its own thing, like, what did I do wrong? Is there something wrong with me? Whatever. And I'm often the one kind of pulling the lens back and saying, okay, well, did anything happen this month? And it's so interesting how many times like this huge change happened. Oh yeah, that was the month that I moved across the country. Or, oh yeah, it's not always like that, but it often is. And so it's really, really interesting to see how things like that can affect it. But on a deeper level, there are other hormonal changes and different patterns, concerns that can show up when you're charting at a deeper level, tracking mucus more specifically, tracking the temperature more specifically. And these are interesting pieces of information that you wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to ask about. They wouldn't necessarily come up in conversation depending on your specific professional designation unless you're looking for it. So I suppose the question is, are you missing an important piece of the puzzle? So again, I'll always say I'm biased because this is my wheelhouse. This is what I do all the time. And from that perspective, I can't imagine not, even asking a few questions as part of an overall protocol when working with women. But that's the question, are you missing an important piece of the puzzle? Because when you track the cycle aspect of things with your clients, you do get this indirect window, right into that hormonal cycle, right into what's going on. And it's often very different than what people will say. So you might have someone say, oh yeah, my cycles are really regular. I always know when my period's coming. But you might not get that additional information about their period pain or their PMS symptoms or the potential signs of progesterone issues on their charts or other potential challenges that would show up only if you're diving in and paying attention to the charting. So I suppose that perspective from the professional standpoint is, what could you be missing if you're not looking at it? And like I said, even if you have a couple general rudimentary questions, unless it's a focus, you're not necessarily really delving in deep to find out what you can learn from tracking the cycle. The third point I wanted to touch on, which I touched on a little bit already, is how the menstrual cycle helps you to detect hormone balance. So tracking the menstrual cycle is a really great way to get a sense of what is happening hormonally with your clients without having to run a whole bunch of diagnostic tests. Now, one thing I always say and discuss with my practitioners is that tracking the menstrual cycle isn't necessarily a substitute. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't ever draw on hormone testing and labs and things like that. But what's interesting about it is that when you're tracking the cycle, you can see what's happening. So if there are certain indicators of hormonal imbalances or things that shouldn't be, things outside of the normal parameters, then it can guide you. It can guide you in terms of what testing you might want to consider getting. So instead of kind of dealing with a blank slate and doing this whole barrage of tests if you're not really sure what's going on, it does direct you into what you think could be going on. And I think that's what's really helpful. I find that getting that overall assessment via the menstrual cycle, you have a starting point. So again, going back to that concept of the vital sign and having it provide general information, but beyond that, provide a specific roadmap. So in terms of very common hormonal imbalances women may have, I think the progesterone issue comes up a lot, estrogen dominance issues come up a lot, issues with detoxification of hormones can come up a lot. And having that window through the menstrual cycle can really help to identify some of those challenges, things that you wouldn't, again, necessarily ask for if you're not specifically looking at the menstrual cycle. Jumping into today's episode with some exciting news to share. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, Class of 2023, starts in January. If you've been searching for a practical way to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing women's health practice, then this is the program for you. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship is a 9-month program that provides the necessary training to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing practice. This program cuts out all the fluff by combining the science with the practical application of charting and allows you to support your clients by monitoring their fifth vital sign in a standardized way. Finally, a program that teaches you to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool with your clients. Transform your practice in 9 months. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAMLive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So a fourth point, and again, I gave an example a little while ago that illustrates this quite well. The menstrual cycle can help us to identify underlying health issues. And it's interesting because there are a lot of different health issues and challenges that can show up in the menstrual cycle in different ways. And the reason for that is because the menstrual cycle is a mirror. It reflects what's happening in your body in overall health. So if, for example, if you have an issue with insulin resistance, if you're on the PCOS spectrum, polycystic ovary syndrome, and you have insulin resistance or inflammation, that shows up in your cycle often by delayed ovulation and multiple cervical fluid patches leading up to potential ovulation, longer cycles, that kind of thing. And, if you have gut issues, and again, that's associated with inflammation and an increase in, histamine, if you have food allergies or sensitivities, that can show up in the menstrual cycle in different ways. If you have thyroid issues, that can show up in the cycle in different ways. So what's interesting is that the menstrual cycle can actually, again, provide that window into what's going on and help you to identify potential issues, again, that you wouldn't necessarily know about if you weren't specifically asking about the cycle. And so for me, I see it as central because the cycle really it's this real-time kind of reflection of what's going on. And when the one thing that you can be sure of is that if you have a client or if you yourself have cycles that are frequently, consistently outside of the normal range, there is a reason for that. There's something causing it. So, it doesn't always tell you exactly. It's not like it gives you a printout and says, you have this problem. So you need to have some support interpreting it. But there is this very real connection between your cycle and health issues, which can be very, very useful in your women's health practice, especially if you're not currently utilizing this particular tool. So in addition to underlying health issues, the menstrual cycle can be an important window into fertility problems in a number of different ways. And so with cycle charting and understanding the role of fertility awareness in terms of identifying ovulation, timing sex accurately, those types of things, it's a very practical, useful tool for any woman who's trying to conceive and has been having difficulties. Because, although timing is not the only issue, and certainly for many women, if not most women who are trying to conceive unsuccessfully, timing may not be the only issue. But without correct timing, if you're not having sex at the right time of the cycle, conception can't happen. That's why fertility awareness makes such an effective birth control method. So it's very helpful from a practical standpoint, fertility awareness cycle charting for conception. But in addition to that, it can provide a window into potential fertility issues. So when you are tracking your cycle or having your clients track their cycles, you can identify if there are certain hormonal issues or challenges or abnormalities that are showing up on the chart. It can also be helpful in that if you have a client whose cycles are actually falling into normal parameters, fairly unproblematic, it can help to potentially refocus the attention on her partner to fully evaluate him so that we can really get to the problem. So I would say that with charting, you can really help to identify what's happening on the female side and get a really important window into what's happening in her cycle, correct timing, and all those factors. But you can also then identify what if she's not the issue? With fertility challenges, up to 50% of the time, there is a male factor piece of it. And 30% of the time, it's completely male factor. And, the rest of the time, it's a combination of the two. But either way, it helps you to kind of get to the bottom and really focus where you need to focus on when you are utilizing that menstrual cycle to identify if there's any underlying issues we can detect through the cycle. Another important point to highlight is how personalized and specialized menstrual cycle charting is. This is a conversation I frequently have with my practitioners as well as my clients. What's really interesting and useful about using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your practice is that it is unique to everybody. No one has the same chart, exactly the same. Now, of course, there's a lot of similarities and things that we're looking for. So there's certainly trends and things like that that are shared between people. You could have 5 different women facing a similar challenge, whether it be a hormonal challenge or nutritional or something like that. And each of them takes the same supplement or does the same strategy. And you can have each of those women respond in different ways. And it's really interesting. I feel like this is something that can help you to become a much better practitioner in the sense that it prevents you from getting into the idea that everybody with this problem is going to do these 5 steps and it's going to work perfectly. With the cycle as a vital sign and a diagnostic tool in your practice, you can actually track the before and after with their cycle and see how their body responds to the interventions. And it can be very surprising to see how quickly one woman can respond and improve with a certain set of recommendations, whereas another woman can do the same thing and have basically no response. So this is a positive because I feel that it helps us to not only have general trends and general suggestions for certain issues, but to help us realize that everyone is not the same. And so we need to broaden our scope and ensure that the recommendations that we make are actually making a difference and suiting this individual. So to put it another way, the menstrual cycle, when we are utilizing it as a diagnostic tool, provides a unique and personalized window into what is happening with that client. And it shows us to a certain degree how effective the interventions that we're suggesting are. Because at the end of the day, if a person is presenting with certain menstrual cycle issues, the interventions that you're suggesting are either going to work or they're not, right? And if they're not working, even though the same interventions have worked for other clients, it means that we're missing something for this person. So from that perspective, I feel like it can be an extremely powerful way to personalize care and really tailor what you're doing to the client in front of you, not necessarily to the condition or what you were taught about this in a book or something like that. It's real time. Like, is this helping this person or not? And last but not least, the menstrual cycle can be utilized in your practice as a feedback tool that you can use to motivate your clients. So for anyone who primarily does client work, when you're working with the public, you're working with women in the field of women's health in one form or another, when you're wanting to support someone to see positive changes, something has to give, right? The person has to do something. So and even if you think about times in your own life when you had an issue with your hormone health or menstrual cycle health, or even a totally different area of your health, when you go to a practitioner, they're giving you something to do. So there's actions you have to take in order to see some kind of improvement. You're not going to see an improvement without doing anything differently. So something has to change. And it can often be difficult, especially if the suggested changes are lifestyle changes. You have to kind of stop doing something that you like to do or start doing something that you're not really fond of, or take this supplement or do this thing. And so anyone who works with clients knows that it can be challenging to motivate your clients to follow through with the actions that are going to be required to see the changes. What I found working with the menstrual cycle and in my own personal life, and if you've been charting, you've probably seen it in your own personal life, is that it's really exciting and motivating for many of us when we make changes and see positive results in the cycle. And so having that additional tool as a way to motivate your clients. And for me, what I love about it is that it goes beyond Lisa said so. So if we're charting and there's a challenge and there's some recommendations that I'm making and the client follows through and they start to see improvements in their cycle, it's not just, it goes beyond Lisa said so to, oh, wow, this is actually working. Like, this is really interesting because I can actually see this change in my cycle. So it's a really powerful, tangible, real-time tool. It's not like, television, you turn on the channel or whatever, that it's like instant like that. But usually within a cycle or so, you can see if you're moving in the right direction. So you're not always getting to the finish line right away, but you can start to see those positive changes. And it's really motivating because it shows that you actually have the power to make changes. And it shows that you're not just doing these things in vain. So as a feedback tool and as a motivational tool, I feel like the cycle charting piece of it can be just incredible with clients and really helpful to kind of take it away from the theoretical to the practical, to like, okay, we're making this intervention and we're seeing this change on the chart. And it can also be helpful, as I had mentioned before, where if you are suspecting, okay, I think this is what it is or whatever, and you work on that and make some changes, but don't see the result in the cycle, it can also help to clarify what steps that actually need to be taken in order to see that change. So there's more. Of course, I could go on all day, but these were the first few things that came to mind for this, the power of utilizing the menstrual cycle in your professional practice and some of the tangible positive benefits there are of doing so. So, just to kind of go through again and to kind of wrap up today, I'll just go through what we talked about. So the first thing I had mentioned was just getting into why we should consider the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and getting into how the menstrual cycle does respond in real time and shows us a window into what's happening with our health, similar to other commonly accepted vital signs. Secondly, if you're not utilizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, if you're not gathering that data, then what are you missing with clients? You're potentially missing out on an important piece of the puzzle, kind of like those softball clues that can really help you to understand what's going on with her. Thirdly, the menstrual cycle is an interesting way to detect hormone imbalance without having to go through a barrage of testing. So it's quite a unique window into the hormonal health of your client that you don't necessarily have to go and order a bunch of testing to get the same information. In addition, the menstrual cycle helps to identify underlying health issues. So not only can it provide general information about hormonal health, there are times when it can help you to identify specific health issues just by tracking what's happening in the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle can also be a window into fertility issues, whether it's highlighting specifically what's happening with your client or potentially shifting that focus to her partner if her cycles look fairly nondescript. The menstrual cycle is a unique and personalized window into your client's health in that it can help you identify what treatment strategies actually work for your client. And so it can prevent you from getting into that idea that, okay, everybody with this problem needs to do these 3 steps and it's going to work. So it really shows you in real time what's working and what's not. And lastly, the menstrual cycle is a feedback tool that can be used to help you motivate your clients because it does show in real time if what you're doing is working. And I find that there's nothing more motivating for a client who's concerned about a certain issue with her cycle, with her hormones, etc., and she makes some changes and sees that improvement in real time as a result of what she did. I feel like that's so empowering and can be really, really helpful to encourage your clients to make those changes and motivate them, especially in cases where it's been challenging to motivate certain clients to make certain changes. One additional thought on that point is that sometimes when you're working with a client and they're, quote, doing all the right things and you're not really seeing improvements, the cycle can really help to clarify if the client is doing enough or if we're focused on that right thing. So sometimes what we think is enough to make that shift or make that change isn't quite enough. And what the cycle helps to do is to give us that firm realization of it's either improving or not. And so when we're not seeing those improvements, it can be that not only the motivation to get your client started on that path, but sometimes it can be the motivation to even show that, okay, you have made certain changes. Maybe you've made some of the changes that you should make, but not necessarily all of them. And sometimes that cycle can show whether or not that little bit of effort is enough. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. So it can be that motivation to clarify, okay, so you're kind of half in, half out in terms of what you want to do. And if you're wanting to see those results, we're going to have to give it a go full on. And so in that way, the chart can be a motivational tool as well to kind of clarify to what degree we have to actually commit to making these changes. So whether you are a women's health professional and you've been listening to this episode thinking about how you can incorporate the menstrual cycle as a vital sign into your professional practice, or if you do not have a practice, but you're thinking about the ways that paying attention and charting and tracking your menstrual cycle could be beneficial to your own personal journey, I hope that you found today's episode interesting and insightful. I find the menstrual cycle absolutely fascinating. I think that that's quite clear given the years of this podcast and all the work that I've done in this area. it's such a personalized way to connect with your body and to really clarify what it is that you need to find that way to your optimal health. And one of the other things I love about it is it takes it away from calorie counting or body size or a number of other common markers that we think of for health and brings it into something that is very unique and separate to a lot of those kind of physical attributes that we're more commonly used to paying attention to. So the menstrual cycle is either within those optimal parameters or it's not. In that way, it's kind of cut and dry. And it's in a way like that perfect science experiment where you can try different things and see how it affects the cycle in real time. And through that process over the years, you really get a good sense of what you can handle, what it looks like when you push it a little bit beyond those ideal boundaries. And it helps you even throughout the years. So in your early 20s, often we can get away with a lot more. We can get away with not sleeping, drinking coffee all the time, working out a ton, not necessarily eating the greatest. But that changes in our 30s into our 40s. Often we're more insulin resistant. We can't get away with the type of eating habits and lifestyle habits that we could have in our 20s. And I find that if we chart our cycles through these different phases, it really helps us to tune into what our true limits are. Sometimes it can be frustrating because there's plenty of women that we know that can, quote, do all the things and not have it affect their cycles. Although I push back on that because we're not looking at their cycles. So there's plenty of people who are out there doing all kinds of things and their cycles aren't necessarily healthy, but we wouldn't know that. But either way, it can be frustrating because it does show us where our weak points are. I think all of us have weak points. All of us have certain areas where it's not like other people where, well, so-and-so can stay up all night and blah, 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 and it doesn't affect them, but I can't or whatever. And so all of us have our own weak points, our own unique health challenges, our own kind of susceptibilities in one way or another. And although it can be frustrating to admit that we have limitations, through charting, it can really help us to identify what works best for us so that we can just get to that point where we can kind of go through life where we're not having constant hormonal problems. We're not having constant ups and downs with a variety of health issues. We can kind of get to that nice sweet spot of health where we can maintain that optimal menstrual cycle because it is reflecting the overall health of our bodies. And it is incredible what happens when we start to pay attention to the connection between our menstrual cycle and our overall health. So I'm going to stop there because, of course, I could talk about this all day. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you can think of somebody in your life who could benefit from hearing today's episode, then I encourage you to share it. The share link is fertilityfriday.com/437. And as I mentioned at the top of the episode, registration is officially open for the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, so FAM Class of 2023. And again, this is a program specifically designed for women's health professionals who are looking to incorporate utilizing fully the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their professional practice. There is no other program out there, just like this one, designed specifically for health professionals to help them incorporate the menstrual cycle in their practice in this way. If this is something that you've been thinking of doing, then be sure to join us. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/famlive. That's FAMMLIVE for additional details and for information about registration. And we'd love to have you in next year's class of 2023. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.